The Los Angeles sun blazed down relentlessly on the runway as a polished private jet shimmered like a diamond beneath the sky. Can you imagine losing everything? Your career, your home, your very identity, not in a fair fight, but by the cruel twist of a system that betrayed you. And then, years later, finding yourself face to face with the kind of arrogant power that shattered your life, only to be given the most unexpected, electrifying chance for redemption? This isn't just a story. It's about a woman who refused to stay broken. Picture this, a bunch of wealthy investors, all in their fancy clothes, gathered around, fake laughing at jokes only their money could find funny. At the center of it all was Richard Vaughn, a billionaire who just loved making people feel small. His empire was built on oil and private jets, and a pure, unadulterated ruthlessness. That day, Richard was showing off his latest toy, a brand new Gulfstream jet, gleaming under the sun, worth more than most of us will ever see in a lifetime. Everyone around him was drooling over its polished wings and luxurious interior. But nobody noticed her. Off to the side, leaning against a chain-link fence, stood a woman. Her clothes were tattered, her shoes worn, and her face told a story of too many nights spent on cold streets. She was black. She was homeless. And to these powerful people, she was utterly invisible. Her name was Naomi Carter. Naomi wasn't begging. She wasn't holding a sign. She was just watching that plane with an intensity that went beyond hunger, deeper than despair. It was recognition. Those wings weren't just metal to her. They were a memory, an echo of dreams once lived, then stolen by a cruel twist of fate. Eventually, Richard noticed her. His laughter froze. He saw her staring, and a smirk stretched across his face. He elbowed his rich friends, whispered something that made them snicker. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, he called out, "Hey, sweetheart, you like my plane? I'll tell you what, I'll give it to you if you can fly it." His voice was pure mockery, every word a jab meant to humiliate. The group roared with laughter, some even clapping like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. To them, Naomi was just a homeless nobody, probably without enough money for her next meal, let alone the skill to pilot a multi-million-dollar jet. But Naomi's lips tightened. She looked at Richard, then at the plane. She could have walked away, swallowed her pride, ignored the cruelty. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and in a voice that carried both strength and a profound sorrow, she said, "I can fly it." The laughter died. A stunned silence fell. Then, another wave of mockery swept through the crowd. "Oh, really?" Richard sneered. His eyes narrowed. "You fly a jet like this? You don't even look like you can afford a bus ticket." They laughed again, but Naomi didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on his, steady and shaken. That's when the air shifted. A quiet tension wrapped itself around the airfield. The homeless woman wasn't joking. She wasn't bluffing. She meant every word, and something about the way she said it made the laughter fade, if only slightly. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "All right, then. Let's hear it. How would you even start this bird? Gonna sprinkle fairy dust on the engine." His voice was sharp with sarcasm, but Naomi stepped closer to the fence, her eyes still on the plane. She began to describe the startup sequence. Her words were precise, technical, undeniably accurate. The investors shifted uncomfortably. Some of them knew enough about aviation to realize she wasn't guessing. She knew. That was the first crack in Richard's armor. He scoffed, trying to mask his surprise, but he couldn't quite hide it. "So what? You read a book once. Doesn't mean you can handle this beauty in the sky." Naomi's expression didn't change. "I don't just know how to fly," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even the cruelest chucklers. "I did fly. I was one of the first black women to log combat flight hours for the Air Force. I trained pilots who went on to fly missions you probably watched on the news. I've landed planes in sandstorms, flown under enemy fire, and guided aircraft through mechanical failures that would make your fancy toy crumble in seconds. Don't tell me what I can't do." A profound hush fell over the group. The air was thick with disbelief, curiosity, and something else. Shame. But Richard wasn't ready to back down. His ego wouldn't allow it. He smirked again, though his laughter didn't carry the same weight this time. "Prove it," he challenged. "Step into that cockpit and prove it. If you can get her off the ground and land her safely, I'll hand you the deed. The plane will be yours." The investors exchanged stunned glances. Was he serious? Was this another cruel game? Or was Richard about to witness something he would regret forever? Naomi didn't hesitate. Her eyes flicked to the plane, then back to him. "I'll take your challenge." The tarmac buzzed. Security guards shifted uneasily. A few investors muttered that this was going too far. But Richard was caught in his own pride. He couldn't back down now. He smirked and gestured. "Then let's go. Show us what you've got, legend." And as Naomi walked toward the steps of that gleaming jet, her tattered shoes carrying her closer to the dream that once defined her life, the real question wasn't about whether she could fly. It was something much, much deeper. Naomi placed her hand on the cold metal of the plane's door, and for the first time in years, her heart beat with the rhythm of engines she once called home. She was no longer invisible. She was about to remind the world exactly who she was. The cabin of that Gulfstream smelled of polished leather, fresh varnish, and the cold arrogance of money. Naomi stepped inside slowly, every single movement watched by dozens of eyes pressed against the airport glass. Richard, meanwhile, was lounging with a smug grin, arms folded, whispering to his friends about the show they were about to witness. To him, this was pure entertainment, humiliating a homeless woman who dared to challenge him. But to Naomi, this was destiny calling her back. She slid her hands along the smooth surfaces of the cockpit as if reuniting with an old friend. The screens, the switches, the throttle, they weren't foreign. They were muscle memory, buried under years of pain and silence, just waiting to be awakened. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lowered herself into the pilot's seat. For a moment, she closed her eyes, shutting out the whispers, the laughter, the mocking voices. She wasn't homeless Naomi Carter anymore. She was Captain Naomi Carter of the United States Air Force. Call sign, Phoenix. The roar of jets filled her memory. The smell of jet fuel, the sharp bark of commanding officers, the adrenaline of missions that demanded perfection. But as her mind reached for those memories, another image pierced through. The night she lost everything. It had been 12 years ago. She'd just completed a successful combat mission, guiding her crew through chaos when their aircraft took heavy fire. They survived, landed safely, but not without cost. Naomi had been hailed a hero at first, decorated, admired, but the politics of military life are rarely fair. When funding cuts and racial biases collided, she found herself on the chopping block. They called it downsizing. But Naomi knew the truth. Her gender, her race, her refusal to play politics had made her a target. Her career ended with a dishonorable sting, a discharge that robbed her of dignity and purpose. She spiraled. The savings disappeared. The house was lost. Friends turned away. Soon, she was nothing more than a face in the shadows of city streets. Her heart ached as those memories clawed at her, but she shook her head sharply. Not today. Today was not about the past. Today was about proving that no matter how far she had fallen, the sky still belonged to her. She placed her hand on the throttle. The hum of the systems as she began the startup sequence was like music. Outside the plane, the crowd stirred. Some were surprised by her confidence. Others smirked, whispering that she was probably just guessing, waiting for her to embarrass herself. Richard leaned against his car, his gold watch gleaming, convinced she'd fail before the wheels even left the ground. Naomi took a slow, deep breath. Her voice was steady as she called out each checklist item under her breath, the way she had done countless times before. Battery on. Avionics check. Fuel flow. Engine start. The engines roared to life, the jet trembling under her command. The investors watching from the tarmac fell silent. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a guess. This was mastery. Naomi's mind drifted back to her childhood. She remembered being a little girl in Alabama, sitting on the hood of her uncle's truck, staring up at the sky as planes streaked overhead. Everyone told her flying wasn't for girls like her. They said she should dream smaller. But her mother, a woman who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, had once told her, "Baby, the sky doesn't belong to anyone. If you want it, take it." That sentence had carried Naomi through every obstacle. And now, sitting in the cockpit of a billionaire's private jet, she felt her mother's words in her chest like fire. Her hand tightened on the yoke. The runway stretched out before her. She had nothing left to lose, and everything to prove. The engines thundered as Naomi guided the jet onto the runway. Outside, the crowd's laughter had quieted into tense murmurs. Even Richard Vaughn faltered as the aircraft began to roll. He hadn't expected her to get this far. He had wanted a quick laugh, easy humiliation. Instead, he was watching the possibility of being utterly upstaged by a homeless woman. His pride wouldn't allow him to accept that outcome. Inside the cockpit, Naomi's hands moved with precision. Her eyes scanned the instruments, her posture calm, professional. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The plane responded to her as though it remembered her touch. With each second, the weight of her past seemed to lift, replaced by the steady hum of purpose. But Naomi's journey to this moment hadn't been simple. As the wheels began to speed down the runway, her mind pulled her back to the years she had fought, not only against enemies in the sky, but also against enemies on the ground. She remembered the sneers of male pilots who doubted her, the endless hours she spent proving she was as good, if not better, than the men beside her. She remembered nights of studying manuals until her eyes blurred, days of training until her body ached, and missions where a single mistake meant death. And then she remembered the betrayal. When she was discharged, she hadn't just lost a job. She lost an identity. The uniform that once gave her dignity was ripped away. She had fought for her country, risked her life, but when she needed support, the system discarded her like trash. Homelessness wasn't a choice. It was the final punishment of a society that praised her when convenient and abandoned her when uncomfortable. The memory burned, but she used it now as fuel. The runway sped beneath her, faster, faster. Her heart pounded as the wind pressed against the wings. She pulled gently on the yoke, and the nose lifted. In one smooth, graceful motion, the billionaire's jet soared into the sky, under her command. Gasps erupted from the crowd below. Investors who had been laughing moments earlier now stood frozen, mouths agape. Some even clapped instinctively, though they quickly stopped, embarrassed to be impressed. Richard's face twisted with disbelief. He had expected her to crash on the ground, not rise above him in triumph. High above Los Angeles, Naomi felt the city shrink beneath her. The skyline glistened, the ocean stretched out endlessly, and the sky embraced her like a long-lost home. Tears blurred her vision as memories of combat flights washed over her, dodging enemy fire, banking hard through storm clouds, guiding terrified young pilots through impossible missions. She remembered the weight of responsibility, the thrill of survival, the pride of protecting lives. She wasn't a homeless woman anymore. She wasn't invisible. She was a legend reclaiming her throne. Naomi steadied the jet, leveling it gracefully, her hands firm and confident. She thought of her fallen comrades, the ones who never made it home, the voices that still echoed in her dreams. She whispered softly, "This is for all of you." Back on the ground, reporters had gathered, cameras clicking furiously. The story of the homeless woman flying a billionaire's jet spread across social media within minutes. Phones buzzed. People watched live streams, jaws dropping as they realized this wasn't a stunt. It was real. And in that moment, as Naomi cut through the clouds, the world began to learn her name again. Naomi Carter, the legend they tried to erase, was back in the sky where she belonged. But the story was far from over. Landing would be the true test. And Richard Vaughn, his pride wounded and boiling, was already plotting to turn the situation back in his favor. The jet sliced through the sky with grace, but Naomi knew the true test wasn't the takeoff. Any skilled pilot could push an aircraft into the air, The real measure of mastery came in the landing, where precision, calm under pressure, and instinct determined life or death. As she adjusted altitude, her eyes swept over the instruments. Everything hummed steady, but Naomi had flown long enough to know when something didn't feel right. There was a subtle imbalance, a slight pull in the controls that shouldn't have been there. She narrowed her eyes. Back on the ground, Richard Vaughn's smile had twisted into something truly venomous. He hadn't expected her to take off, but now that she was in the air, humiliation loomed over him like a thundercloud. If she landed successfully, his mockery would collapse in front of witnesses, investors, and cameras. That thought was unbearable. So he made a decision, dirty, desperate, and dangerous. Slipping away from the crowd, he whispered instructions to one of his technicians, a man who owed his fortune to Richard's ruthless empire. "Tamper with the systems," Richard hissed. "Make sure she can't land clean." The technician hesitated, sweat gathering at his brow. "Sir, that could be dangerous." Richard's glare sliced through the air. "Do it. I don't care if she scrapes the runway. She's not making me look like a fool." In the cockpit, Naomi felt the plane respond sluggishly as she began her descent pattern. Her hands tightened around the yoke. The aircraft wobbled more than it should have. "Something's off," she muttered. For a split second, fear clawed at her chest, but then the old instinct surged back. She had flown through worse. She had landed with an engine on fire, guided planes through desert storms that swallowed the sky whole. She wasn't about to let a spoiled billionaire stop her. She steadied her breath, remembering the calm she had always carried into combat. The clouds parted, revealing the runway stretched out beneath her like a challenge. The crowd was gathered at the edge, eyes wide, cameras raised, breath held. Some expected a crash. Others secretly prayed she'd succeed, because in her success they saw a piece of themselves. The jet dipped, the landing gear lowered, the runway rushing closer. Naomi's jaw tightened as she corrected for the imbalance. Sweat ran down her temple, but her eyes never wavered. She whispered to herself, "Steady, Phoenix, steady." The aircraft bucked once, twice, but she held firm, guiding it with hands that remembered every vibration of metal and sky. The wheels touched down with a screech, bouncing hard. Then, with an expert correction, she settled the jet onto the asphalt, rolling it to a smooth stop. Silence. Then, an eruption of cheers from the crowd. The impossible had just been made real. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Social media feeds exploded with footage of a homeless woman not only flying, but landing a billionaire's private jet with perfection. But Richard Vaughn was not clapping. His face was pale with rage, his pride shredded. He stormed toward the jet as Naomi powered down the engines, trying to mask the tampering as coincidence. But Naomi had already suspected foul play, and her eyes hardened the moment she saw him approach. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cabin door opened slowly, and Naomi descended the stairs of the Gulfstream. The cheers from the onlookers washed over her, a sound she hadn't heard in years. Applause not from soldiers, not from commanders, but from ordinary people who had just witnessed history. Tears pricked her eyes, but she held her chin high. She wouldn't let anyone see her broken. She wanted them to see her strength, her resilience, the truth of who she was. Richard stormed forward, his designer shoes slapping against the tarmac, his face twisted with fury. "You think this proves something?" He spat, his voice sharp enough to cut through the cheering. "You're nothing but a washed-up pilot. You don't belong in my world. That plane is worth millions, and you—" Naomi's voice sliced through his rant, calm but commanding. "I belonged in the sky long before you ever bought your first toy jet. I've flown missions that saved lives, protected this country, and pushed me to the brink of death. And you? You've bought your way into a cockpit you'll never understand." Her words struck deep. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling like waves. Some people began booing Richard. Others held up their phones, capturing every second. The billionaire who had mocked her now stood exposed, his cruelty laid bare. Naomi's chest tightened as she thought of her past. The years lost, the comrades gone, the nights under bridges where she questioned if she had any worth left. She had almost believed the world's lies about her. But today, in front of strangers who were now chanting her name, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. She looked Richard in the eye, her voice steady. You wanted me to prove myself. I did. And you tried to sabotage me because you were afraid of the truth. That someone you mocked, someone you stepped over, someone you thought was invisible, was greater than you will ever be. The crowd erupted again, louder this time. Reporters shoved microphones forward. Ms. Carter, is it true you were in the Air Force? Can you tell us your story? The name Carter rolled across the tarmac, reigniting a legacy that had been buried for too long. Naomi hesitated, her throat tight, but then she spoke, her voice trembling yet unyielding. I was once a pilot, one of the first black women in combat aviation. They tried to erase me, but today, I'm telling you, I'm still here. The audience roared. People shouted her name. Some cried. Strangers reached for her hands as though touching her was touching history itself. Naomi felt her heart swell with something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. Richard's face burned red. He tried to shout above the noise, but his voice was drowned out. His empire thrived on control, on making others feel small. But in that moment, he was the one shrinking, fading into the background, while Naomi rose like the phoenix her call sign had named her after. For the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't forgotten. She was Naomi Carter, the legend who refused to die. As the cameras rolled, the story of the homeless woman who flew a billionaire's jet spread like wildfire across the nation. In coffee shops, in living rooms, on phones across the country, Americans saw not just a pilot, but a fighter who represented every forgotten soul who deserved a second chance. By the next morning, Naomi Carter's face was on every major news outlet in America. Clips of her piloting the Gulfstream trended across social media platforms with captions like "From the streets to the skies," and "the legend they tried to erase." Hashtags with her name filled timelines. People who had never heard of her were suddenly invested in her story. For the first time in years, Naomi wasn't invisible. She was a symbol of resilience, courage, and redemption. In living rooms across the country, families watched the footage with awe. Veterans sat straighter in their chairs, recognizing the quiet authority in her voice when she spoke about her past. Young girls, especially little black girls who had never seen someone like them celebrated for flying, saw a hero reflected in Naomi's story. In shelters, homeless communities huddled around televisions, whispering that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them, too. Richard Vaughn, on the other hand, faced a storm unlike anything his billions could control. Investors began pulling out of deals. Headlines called him arrogant, cruel, and reckless for attempting to humiliate a homeless woman, only to have his plan backfire spectacularly. Footage of his knee as he mocked Naomi circulated endlessly, spliced side by side with her flawless landing. His empire was crumbling, his reputation shredded. No amount of spin could make him the victor in this story. Meanwhile, Naomi's life transformed overnight. Reporters camped outside the shelter she had once slept in. Former military comrades reached out, some in tears, apologizing for not standing by her when the system discarded her. Veterans groups launched campaigns to restore her record, arguing that her discharge had been unfair and driven by politics rather than merit. Within days, petitions flooded Congress, demanding her reinstatement and recognition. Naomi, humbled by the sudden spotlight, struggled to process it all. She had gone from being unseen on the streets to being invited onto national talk shows. She told her story with raw honesty about the pride of service, the pain of betrayal, and the crushing weight of homelessness. She didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't make herself a victim, either. She spoke with dignity, reminding the world that heroes can fall, but they can also rise again. One night, Naomi was invited to Washington, D.C. A special ceremony had been arranged at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Under the towering shadow of aircraft that had shaped history, she stood in front of a crowd of military officials, lawmakers, journalists, and families. Her heart pounded as the Secretary of Defense took the stage, holding a medal. "Tonight," he said, his voice steady, "we honor Captain Naomi Carter, not just for her service, but for her unbreakable spirit. For too long, her legacy was buried by injustice, but her actions remind us that true greatness cannot be erased. Captain Carter, you are and always will be an aviation legend." Tears streamed down Naomi's face as the medal was placed around her neck. The crowd erupted into applause that shook the museum walls. For the first time in over a decade, she felt the weight of recognition, of being seen, not as a homeless woman, but as the pilot, the protector, the leader she always was. Later that night, Naomi stood before the actual jet she had flown days earlier, now donated to the museum by embarrassed investors eager to escape association with Richard Vaughn. A plaque at the base of the exhibit read, "Flown by Captain Naomi Carter, September 2025, a symbol of courage, resilience, and redemption." Naomi touched the cold metal, her reflection staring back at her. She whispered softly, "Mama, I made it." As for Richard Vaughn, his empire collapsed in waves. Lawsuits poured in after Naomi revealed his sabotage attempt. The FAA launched investigations. His investors abandoned him. Within months, his name was synonymous with arrogance and disgrace. He tried to rebuild, but America had chosen its hero, and it wasn't him. Naomi, meanwhile, embraced her second chance. She didn't buy mansions or chase luxury. Instead, she started a foundation dedicated to helping homeless veterans, ensuring that no one who had served their country would ever be left behind the way she had been. The foundation grew quickly, funded by donations from everyday Americans moved by her story. Naomi traveled the nation, speaking at schools, shelters, and air bases, reminding everyone that strength isn't defined by wealth, but by the will to rise after the fall. And every time she spoke, she ended with the same words, "The sky doesn't belong to anyone. If you want it, take it." Her story became more than just a viral moment. It became a movement. Pilots began requesting her presence at air shows. Aviation schools offered scholarships in her name. She even returned to the skies, training young pilots and sharing the knowledge that had once been her lifeblood. Watching their eyes light up as they touched the controls for the first time filled her with a joy deeper than any medal could provide. Naomi Carter was no longer homeless. She was no longer forgotten. She was exactly what she was always meant to be, an aviation legend who had proven that no matter how hard life tried to break you, the sky was always waiting. And so the woman once mocked by a billionaire stood taller than any empire he could buy. Because while money fades and power shifts, true greatness endures forever. Now, I have to ask you, after hearing Naomi's incredible journey, what one thing really stood out to you? Was it her defiance, her skill, or the way she rose above all the injustice? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to hear your take.